I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
All right. So as I said, I heard about this first in a recent R.M. Brown show. And he just in passing made a quick reference to John McWhorter making this statement. And I was like, what? Made a note, went and dug it up. It's in the New York Times. I don't have a subscription. So I put the citation in the show description, but there's no link. Because I had to go to, again, what I do, really appreciate about the job, the search engines to get access to this. And so here we go. So this is the text of, I think it was from, with these things, they always put it at the bottom. So this came out March 28th, a couple of days ago. But John McWhorter in the New York Times, I did not feel the need to see people like me on TV or in books, John McWhorter. So I thought about this and I said, so the way R.M. Brown described it, I said, wow, this sounds like a conservative reactionary version of the Vernon philosophy of black media avoidance. And I think indeed it is. So I guess we'll come back to that, and I'll just go through this very quickly, and then I'll come back to what is the Vernon philosophy of black media avoidance, and talk a little bit then about what I think this is also a reactionary response to, which is Huey Newton's revolutionary suicide, which is why the title on the cover photo is Class Resurrection, as opposed to class suicide or revolutionary suicide. But yeah, so right, class resurrection, right. It's a short piece. These are just part of his weekly column of disseminating the kind of psychological warfare that, again, that I would argue in this case just quickly is distilled through voices like Killer Mike. And now maybe, I don't know how they're going to, what this album is going to, or what this what's the word I'm looking for? This collaboration is going to sound like, but I wonder to what extent it's going to come out as, again, the revolutionary, or not revolutionary, but the very black nationalist argument around black capitalism, the narrow nationalist arguments around black capitalism, and I wonder if that's where, unfortunately, we're heading. But because I thought immediately of the Dead Preds verse, what was it? Well, they said I Ching. I think it's supposed to be I Ching. What was it? Reform into a socialist economy. Do like ants for self and form a socialist economy. I don't know if they're headed in that direction. I don't know. I'm worried. Anyway. So just a couple excerpts from this thing. So of course, McWhorter, if anybody is unfamiliar, black conservative, and I'm going to share a little bit of his history too. Used to, in fact, was the subject of one of my very first black commentary years ago. I ended up in a debate with him and Michael Eric Dyson. We'll come back to some of that in a few minutes. But just a black conservative with a long history of being the very well platformed and paid black spokesperson of white conservative politics, specifically at one point working directly out of the Manhattan Institute, which is itself just one of the handful of elite white supremacist imperialist think tanks that we're going to come back to that. But that's who this guy is. So that's why he has this weekly column, which I never read, but had just heard about in this, so, and this is why. So, and he's saying, I didn't need the Band-Aids that look like my complexion. And I never really saw well, you know, I didn't need to see black people on TV looking like me. I didn't need that. I don't know what all this, you know, this call for representation really is. So he says here, it reminds me of how many people complain that they don't see themselves in movies, books, etc. When I was growing up, I didn't much either, but I can't say that it bothered me. By the 1970s, black people in general were by no means rare on the tube, whether it was Sanford and Son, the Jeffersons, or Roots. But I saw little of black people like me specifically, as in a comfortably middle-class, bookish black teenager, slightly on the weird side. It was nice to see a me on the TV now. And then it was nice to see a me on TV now and then, as in one episode of The Facts of Life. Yes, I watched it. Remember, there was less to do before the internet and prestige television, that had a guest character who was a black girl given to standing up and proclaiming passages in Latin. That's interesting. I watched The Facts of Life growing up, and I always actually, I can't remember. I'm sure. Well, I can't remember if I'm thinking back incorrectly, because eventually I developed a crush on Kim Fields, of course, but I don't know if it was then or if it was later. I mean, definitely by Living Single, but I don't know if it was that early. I was pretty young then. But anyway, but what he leaves out here, by the way, is something that I always remember getting from Mark Anthony Neal's work, that all of these shows that he's referencing, which is something, of course, he can't consider in a piece like this, are themselves responses to the Black Power era and moments in Black struggle where Black people wanted and clamored for improved or increased representation. This was after the Kerner Commission report that itself called for part of the solution, which is more highlighted than the more substantive solutions that they offered up, but that the Kerner Commission said more Black representation in news, more Black representation, more positive Black representation in news and in news media, but also in media in general, as opposed to, and they meant positive by the standards of Step and Fetch It, and you know, what's the more famous one that is now slipping my that started off on radio, co-written by a son of a Klansman. What was that? What was the other one? Oh man, what was the other one? And the NAACP used to protest it all the time. Oh my goodness, this is terrible. My memory is completely, anyway, it'll come back. Amos and Andy, thank you, Brooke. And thank you, Sounds of St. Elsewhere. Yes, thank you, Amos and Andy. So after all those protests, you know, and all these uprisings and all of this, the part of the response was, okay, we'll give them Sanford and Son and What's Happening, and in fact, Mark Anthony Neal's work points out that the restaurant in which we would find Shirley and the gang in What's Happening was in a spot named after a literal restaurant where Panthers and radicals used to gather, and all of those politics was stripped and replaced with just sort of a silly kids show. So he leaves out all of the politics of why we got these shows, only to focus on the fact that he didn't see the particular Black nerd or whatever that he was in those shows. But what I enjoyed, he says, about TV was seeing something other than myself. I liked it as a window on the world, not as a look into my own life. There were plenty of books about Black people, but they tended to be about poor, working class Black people, and often depicted Black lives prescribed by discrimination and equality. He said, he doesn't, So of course, my African-centered community is clearly, of course, you don't want to look for yourself because you hate yourself. You're defining yourself on a European, Eurocentric standard. Some of my materialist community would rightfully also be saying, no, your class interests weren't being reflected, and your attempts at a Black bourgeois aspirant worldview weren't reflected in those shows, and you didn't want to be reminded of those who were quote unquote dragging you down and dragging the race down. Whereas even people like me, I used to love those shows. Skip Coon has a song called James, and it's parts 1 and 2, if I'm not mistaken. And one of the parts is we got plenty of JJs who want to be a James, because James, the father on Good Times, to this day remains my favorite, maybe my favorite all-time television character and representation of Black fatherhood. And I know that he is flawed, so please don't get me wrong into thinking that I don't know that there's a flaw here in that. And nonetheless, that's the truth. So some of us loved those shows. Some of us loved how, again, I remember vividly growing up in suburban Section 8 apartments, in our apartment, feeling like even a show like Good Times helped me understand my life vis-a-vis this suburb. And why, and it literally helped me understand why, for instance, that white kid on my soccer team said he can't come to my party because he said, my father said, you live in the ghetto. And why later on, one of my favorite Black friends from up the street who grew up in a single family home with a garage and all of that, she said, oh yeah, no, we were the Cosby kids. We looked at you as growing up in the hood. It was just so funny. So for him to say, oh, I didn't, you know, all these Black people talk about all this discrimination and working class. Oh, but I neither needed nor sought out more such books. How much me did I need? I read to learn about what I didn't know. So this is also, oh man. You know what? I should have played it. I should have played that. I should have played that. Oh man, what was the on Charlie Rose. Oh, I should have had that. Yeah, let's and I don't pretend to be, we got to do that. Let's do that. Let's take a moment with that. I don't pretend to be the biggest Toni Morrison student, fan, whatever, but what she did here. So while McWhorter is saying, I don't need to read about myself, why would I want to read about what I don't know? Because I've already got myself down. That reminds me, by the way, of students who show up in my classes and say, why do I need Black studies when I'm Black? Or, you know, I mean, it's such an absurd and perfectly New York Times comment, but it stands in complete juxtaposition to this here.
I think I want to ask you the question, can you imagine writing a novel that's not centered about race? And you said absolutely.
Yes.
Will you?
That's what he asked me. I think, see, I answered the question he didn't pose. You know, Tolstoy writes about race.
Yeah.
All the time. So does Zola, so does James Joyce. Now, if anybody can go up to an imaginary James Joyce and say, you write about race all the time, it's central in your novels, when are you going to write about what? Because you see, the person who asks that question doesn't understand that he or she is also raced. So to ask me when am I going to stop, or when, if I can, is to ask a question that, in a sense, is its own answer. Yes, I can write about white people. White people can write about Black people. Anything can happen in art. There are no boundaries there. Having to do it or having to prove that I can do it is what was embarrassing or insulting. In this book, I did.
It was insulting that people, help me understand. What was insulting? The idea that you felt like you had to prove that you could write without...
Yeah, the question was posed as though it were a desirable thing to do, to write about white people or to write not about race. That's what that means to me. And that it was a difficult thing to do, a higher level of artistic endeavor, or it was more important, and that I was still writing about marginal people, and why don't I come into the mainstream?
Aren't you importing too much into the question?
Maybe.
I think so.
Well, what else could it be, Charlie? What does that mean? What?
That whole clip is I mean,
Now listen, that's called my boy.
I mean, it is. It's just, I mean, because so McWhorter is presenting the exact opposite. McWhorter is saying, I don't need that. I don't want that. I don't want a discussion of myself or my community or the experience of those that I certainly want no connection to, or am certainly classed out of or away from. I don't want any of that. And to suggest that I should want that or to suggest that I need that is demeaning, because it points us towards the unnecessary. And here's Toni Morrison saying, you want me to prove my skill and worth by my ability to write beyond myself. And I'm saying I don't need to do that. I don't want to do that. I can demonstrate I am as good as anyone can be without having to write about anyone else. The depth and breadth of Black world experience is sufficient for umpteen world welcomed and renowned books and films. And McWhorter is saying, nah. Because in fact, when I started my graduate study, I explicitly did not want to study Black English. It was too close to home. What fascinated me and still does are languages utterly unlike the one I grew up with. This is what I do. This is what I do my academic work on. I am happy to write about Black English, but I do it out of civic duty. What first hooked me on languages was hearing someone speak Hebrew. Really, John? Hebrew? Now, and again, juxtapose this to for instance, Paul Robeson, who didn't just get excited if he heard someone speak Hebrew. He went and learned, actually, I don't know if Hebrew was one of them, but he went and learned 20 whatever languages throughout the African continent, throughout Europe, throughout Asia, throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. He learns all these languages, not so that he can talk about how great the white ones are and how much he wants to run from the African, but to explicitly state that the African languages he learned are of whatever can do and more whatever anyone else's does, and that he proudly proclaimed himself an African. He did that as an expression of his self-love and love for community and love for the struggle of his people and in solidarity of his people. He didn't have to demean his blackness to praise his development and love and of learning languages from Europe and Asia and elsewhere. But still, the idea that a black person is deprived and not exploring what they are already relate to as is not as natural as it sounds. This position is rooted, one suspects, as a defense against racism, in a sense that learning most meaningfully takes place within a warm comfort zone of cultural membership. But it's a wide, wide world out there, and this position ultimately limits the mind and the soul. I question its necessity in 2023. The etymology of the word education is related to the Latin educare or educare, whatever, meaning to lead outward, not inward. So as I made a note here to myself, is he saying that whites then should study African history more? Should Europeans not study European history? Is he saying, because that line doesn't exist in here, by the way. There's no line in here where he says, so white folks, stop studying yourself. He's not telling any other group that self-study is unnecessary. It's only black people he's saying should be less interested in studying themselves. Then it gets more egregious. So just as the other day, Killer Mike is talking about how you can say what you want about Kwame Ture, the socialist, but he needed a black capitalist to get himself his dead body back over to Africa. So here comes McWhorter, and this is why we got Josh Meyer's book on Black study being used in 2 of my classes this semester. This is what 2 of my 4. This is why we got albeit with all due respect to those with real 4.4s and to my own career up until like a year or so ago, one of these classes is a capstone and the other 3 are not as common a core as the courses I was teaching. So I don't have, for most of my career, I had 4 courses with 30 plus students in each class. Now I have 4 courses with, I don't know, the average would probably be somewhere around, I don't know, 10, if I averaged them all out, probably about 10 to 12, which feels like so, but anyway, still 4. But the point I'm saying is that one of the reasons that Meyer's work is so important is because, especially on his chapter on Du Bois, notwithstanding the later conclusions of people that he praises in the book, like Professor Montero, with all due respect. The point is that Du Bois is in Myers's work being, again, excavated and restored as the radical socialist Pan-Africanist that he was, as opposed to someone who could be reduced to this here, as does McWhorter. W.E. Du Bois had no such idea. He wrote, "I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summoned Aristotle and Aurelius, and what soul I will come all graciously with no scorn nor condescension. Du Bois adapted these white works in his own needs and predilections. Even the naked racism he lived with daily did not lead him to draw a line around white things as something alien to his essence. Rather, he insisted that these works were, in fact, part of his self, regardless of how wider society saw that self or how figures like Shakespeare and Aristotle would have seen him. All right, so but what about all right, John, so what about those of us who have no problem reading Marx and Parenti or watch R.M. Brown's show? What does that have to do with anything? So we deal with that, and then we happily delve into all of the wondrous, expansive, and infinite Blackness in the African diaspora and beyond. So nobody is saying, so even those who clamor for more representation are not saying we don't want to see anybody else. Or as he says here, I watch TV to see somebody else. They're not saying that. They're saying we would just like to see some of ourselves represented in a positive and accurate way. So I just thought that was fascinating. This complete reactionary take on both the idea of being represented, and then, as I want to get to here for a couple minutes, the idea of the Vernon philosophy of Black media avoidance. Because similar to what he says at the end there, selfishly, personally, I watch TV to watch other people too. But it's just like the reverse hashtag, folks. It's my self-love of and even bias, admittedly, if we get down to the brass tacks of it, for Black America or the Black American experience, has nothing to do with a disinterest in radical Pan-Africanism or somehow some anti-diaspora sentiment. It's just a natural, I think, result of a bias of experience that I would expect anyone to have. Not about a superiority or a disinterest in willing to work with others. So, but quickly before I put the link in the show description. I did want to I'll just share this very quickly because it's a lot longer than I remembered. But this was actually the reason why I wrote the first commentary I did, and I will not deny how pressed and prideful I was when Glenn Ford published it. And it was after hearing John McWhorter was going to be a regular, at the time, weekly guest on what was Michael Eric Dyson's Radio 1 radio show. And this was before we fully, or at least I fully was aware of this is in 2006. This was before I was fully aware of what Dyson was. And you could see how pressed I was. Although I don't know if I did this, but the fact that I would submit doctor and PhD in my name, that's how pressed I was, being a relatively newly minted PhD. But the point that I would want to get to, or let me in highlight here, is because it's long. I had a lot to say, but is that this is who McWhorter was then, and I think still is now, even though he doesn't technically work directly, I think, anymore for the Manhattan Institute. But what I was saying first here about Dyson is that Dyson is fast approaching the remaining pantheon of untouchable Black figures, and more than that, I was becoming aware who he was. Actually, I was more aware than let me give myself a little more credit here, because I said he is fast approaching the remaining pantheon of untouchable Black figures. And more than that, by noticing his increasing appearances on shows like Democracy Now!, Dyson has also been selected by the white left as the Black community spokesman. This means his willingness to engage McWhorter further magnifies that negative impact on our community and further legitimizes McWhorter to his real audience, the white conservative right. Okay, I was okay. A little better off than I thought there. And even while mentioning his work for the Manhattan Institute so as to forever protect against the lack of full disclosure, McWhorter has never been taken to task, I think it should say. Oh boy, McWhorter was never taken. No, that's right. McWhorter was never taken to task for exactly what that means. So Dyson never really gets into what that really means. In his Manhattan Institute anthology, Tom Wolfe happily tells the tale of a former World War II British fighter pilot, Anthony Fisher, who, fearing the encroaching socialist movement in Europe, establishing in England the Institute for Economic Affairs to promote free market ideology. His fears were not of politicians, but of powerful ideas such as Marxism and Darwinism that changed the course of history. And in 1978, he established the Institute's North America cousin, the Manhattan Institute. And I note the importance of that in citing Dr. Amos Wilson. Remember recently somebody said I never read his book. Interesting. Dyson can read aloud the late Dr. Amos Wilson's chapter, The Policy Formation Process from Blueprint for Black Power. The chapter begins with quite an accurate description of policy and its purpose. We may refer to policy rather informally and imprecisely, yet pragmatically, as the rules of the game, as the rules of power used to organize, direct, and regulate the activities, the production and consumption of the resources, internal and external social relations and institutions of a society in order to defend and advance what it perceives as its overall interests. You know what? I should have put this in the second edition of the Buying Power book. Damn. Because this is exactly right. And this is why I've always had, or long had, this interest in a focus on on political power and public policy. And it's interesting that a lot of Wilson's supporters, who, particularly those who attack me about my criticism of his support for buying power, don't ever bring this point up or this chapter up, where he focuses on the purpose of public policy and the role specifically of think tanks like the Manhattan Institute in helping shape the public policy, which, as he says here, are there to organize, direct, and regulate the activities, the production and consumption of the resources, internal and external social relations and institutions of a society in order to defend and advance what it perceives as its overall interests. Anyway, so that's who McWhorter was and is always working for, a white conservative community that is looking for him to give them an analysis of blackness that comforts them, and to have him be brought into spaces as an authentic spokesperson of blackness, because he's carrying very white conservative ideas that the Manhattan Institute and others like them couldn't carry directly themselves into the community.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.